Hello, and welcome to a special episode of Bad Gays, a podcast all about evil and complicated queers in history. My name is Ben Miller. I'm a writer, historian, and a member of the board of the Schwules Museum in Berlin. And today we have a very special guest, Hannah Pezzack, who is a music journalist, a writer, a DJ, a curator, and who's here to talk to us about someone that I've been trying to get someone to do a special episode about for a while, so I'm really happy she's here. Hannah, welcome to the show.
Hello, it's so good to be here, long-time listener. And yeah, today we're going to be talking about the experimental electronica band Coil. So, namely, it's two frontmen and only consistent members, the vocalist Geoff Rushton, who performed under the stage name John Balance, and Peter Christopherson, who is nicknamed Sleazy.
I have to tell you, Hannah, the painting that you see over my shoulder while we're recording is by a friend of the show, an artist named Elijah Berger, who is a Coil super fan.
No
and
way!
has been very, very excited that this is happening. So fans of the show will know that we used Elijah's art for our Caligula episode. And so I know Elijah's really excited to hear this conversation, and we're obviously happy to have it as well.
I mean, that's actually really great to know, because I was a bit concerned that maybe people would not be you would not be very familiar with Coil's music. It is quite difficult to just describe in words, like what it actually sounds like. Over the course of they were functional for about 20 years, from 1982 to about 2004. And during that time, they built an absolutely very varied sonic repertoire. You know, there's the industrial noise of their first album, Scatology, the warped acid house of Love's Secret Domain, the dark ambient drone of Time Machines, and the pagan-tinged neofolk of Music to Play in the Dark. So their sound was constantly evolving, and it refused to stay in one genre for long. And it's also important to say, of course, that Coil was much more than just a band. Their work extended into film, into poetry, photography, painting, drawing, and performance, blurring the boundaries of sound and visual art, music and ritual. But at the heart of it all was an intense interest in the occult, in magic, alchemy, esoteric symbolism. But just as central was their homosexuality, a queerness expressed through sexualized violence, the taboo, bodily fluids, blood, sweat, and scat, and an obsession with self-annihilation.
These are a few of my favorite things.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you, of course, know them and you're familiar, because I would say that Coil are a cult band in more ways than one. Their music kind of circulated through mail order self-releases and these kind of coveted collectible vinyls. So it's not particularly well known amongst the mainstream. And I don't know, what do you think? Like, do you feel that they have reached a queer audience? I feel like maybe a bit more in the contemporary moment, but not so much back in the 90s and 80s.
It's funny, I really couldn't tell you. I mean, I came to Coil through two dear friends. One of them, Elijah, who I mentioned. The other one is Michael Oswell, who actually introduced you and I and kind of started this whole show off. But I guess I just have gay guy friends with very dark and exquisite taste in electronic music. I mean, I think that's really the lesson of this.
Yeah, it's quite telling, really. They did not ever really give interviews to sort of mainstream queer publications. There was a wonderful interview that I discovered in a radical fairy zine from 2004 called Heathen Harvest. And the interviewer asked Coil, have you ever felt acknowledged or accepted by the larger mainstream queer community? And the band just say, no, full stop, which I guess says a lot. Queer iconography just flows throughout all of their work. They adopted the image of the black sun or the solar anus as their insignia, and their discography is divided into two phases: a solar period marked by abrasive, sonically intense material, and a more introspective lunar phase where the music became gentler, more composed with marimba, strings, and a near kind of new age atmosphere. And throughout all of this, the lyricism is laced with this homoeroticism, with song titles like The Anal Staircase and The Gimp. And while on tour in the early 2000s, Coil were joined on stage by the Black Sun Productions, two, quote, very well endowed Swedish sex workers, Massimo and Pierce, who performed erotic striptease while dressed as wizards. So despite all of this, quite surprisingly, Coil has tended to attract a mainly heterosexual male fan base. I think we can come back to this a bit later on, but it's fascinating to me how long they've been considered like what's called straight guy music. I do suspect that this is, partly due to their very techie aesthetic. Machines, particularly synthesizers, have been coded as masculine and straight, and we can see evidence for this in the way that female electronica artists have been, very much overlooked until quite recently. And it is important to say as well, like Coil were moving in this milieu of like gay music, like disco, Elton John, George Michael, and they sort of stand outside of this entirely. And lastly, I think Coil has tended to be associated a bit more with what's called like shock rock. So Ben, probably you know the band Rammstein, right?
I mean, yes, I live in Germany. Come on.
Yeah, I mean, they're fascinating, right? Like this heavy metal band that's entirely composed of heterosexual members, and yet they perform on stage with a gigantic penis cannon that sprays the crowd with water. So, yeah, that's kind of shock rock for you, I guess. Very campy, and Coil were
Yeah.
perceived as sort of, in this
There's also
in this
some
vein.
allegations. There's also some allegations that we should mention about Rammstein of abuse and assault of young female fans. It is interesting though with Coil because I almost feel like there's a certain kind of super hardcore straight male crowd for whom, if it's masculine reading men, extremely gory details of gay sex can actually in a weird way be okay because it almost reads as a kind of masculinism, you know? Like it's something that I've seen in a couple of other kind of affective responses to things, and I just thought I'd mention it because I think it fits into this thing that you're talking about with Coil here.
Yes, that totally resonates. Yeah, there's this sort of, it's the desire to provoke almost that I think straight men are drawn to. I mean, also I think Coil's music does have a lot of sensitivity and emotionality that maybe straight men don't get elsewhere, but indeed like this provocativeness is kind of central, and you see it come up a lot in interviews. But I do think that sort of reading ends up sort of flattening Balance and Sleazy's homosexuality, which is, of course, not incidental but foundational to their artistic vision. And one of the main reasons I really wanted to make this episode is because I feel that Coil kind of deserve a bit of a queer rehabilitation. I read this wonderful book in my research called Everything Keeps Dissolving, which is a collection of conversations of Coil from various zines and magazines and journals. And the writer Nick Soulsby speaks very eloquently about the homophobia that pervaded music journalism from, the early 1980s till, at the very least, early 2000s. He writes, quote, "Reading hundreds of Coil interviews, a tragicomedy becomes clear. Coil repeatedly explained that their lived experience as gay men was the creative force underpinning their work, only to be faced with a blank absence of response. In a statement Balance gave in the mid-1990s, he said, 'For a long time, we were the most out on a limb or experimental gay group for sure in England.' Balance then shrewdly pointed out that people felt more comfortable pretending gay music only existed as a ghetto of flamboyant disco, something safe, soft, and ignorable, and because they did not fit this mold, their gay identity was deemed ephemeral, not worth engaging with." The discomfort around talking about the band's sexuality from music journalists at the time, of course, speaks to the fact that Coil's existence coincided exactly with the AIDS pandemic, a disease that took the lives of many of their friends, their lovers, and creative peers, as well as the grotesque homophobia that defined straight society's response to the crisis. So I just want to get a couple of caveats out the way before we go on. So for the sake of brevity, I will be focusing primarily on Sleazy and John, but it is crucial to say that Coil was composed of lots of other people, including Drew McDowell, Stephen Thrower, Thibault Sandra, and lots of others, and they each played a really important role in shaping the band's sound across different periods. So Coil fans, if you've spotted what I'm doing, I'm sorry, we can't go into everybody, and please don't come for me. Also on that note, while I will cover some of Coil's music, their discography is absolutely huge. a chaotic sprawl of side projects, countless aliases, EPs, compilations, and live recordings. Incredibly, this means that more than 20 years after the band ceased to exist, there's still new music being released. So yeah, unfortunately, I will not be able to get into all of it. So with that all out of the way, and without any further ado, let's get stuck in. Sleazy was born on the 27th of February, 1955, and he was the son of titled aristocrats. His father had taught engineering at Cambridge before being knighted, so Sleazy had a fairly privileged upbringing and even attended a private Quaker school. After finishing his A-levels, he received a transfer scholarship to a university in New York, where he studied computers, creative writing, and new media. After returning to England, he got a job at Hypnosis, the London design firm behind some of the most iconic album covers of the 1970s, including early Pink Floyd and Peter Gabriel records. So Hypnosis were actually responsible for the Dark Side of the Moon album cover. And I think within this, you can really see Sleazy's aesthetic. He was pushing Hypnosis away from the kind of classic psychedelia of that era into something much weirder and darker and more warped. Later in life, during the 1990s, he would become one of the most sought-after music video directors of the era, working with the likes of Erasure, Rage Against the Machine, Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin, and Nine Inch Nails, as well as some quite unexpected characters like Cliff Richards and Van Morrison. But back in the 1970s, Sleazy was developing a fascination with gore stage makeup and had joined an organisation called the Casualties Union, where he simulated injuries to help train the emergency services. In 1977, he put those skills to dramatic use, creating a window display for the launch of the famous Boy clothing shop on London's King's Road, a hub for punk and new romantic fashion. So Sleazy's concept for the display was pretty brutal. It involved the idea that a young skinhead had broken in, started a fire, and died in the blaze, and all that remained of him was a single Doc Marten boot with part of his leg still inside.
Oh my God. Jesus. So you really see the fascination with these very sort of violent aesthetics right from the beginning, but that's also kind of amazing. I mean, it's the apotheosis of house down boots. I guess it's house down boot.
Yeah, I mean, also he filled the inside of the shop with all of these newspaper clippings. He kind of collected news stories about young boys who had died, and this is a bit more like unsettling, I find. And I think we can get back into this a bit later, but Sleazy in particular's fascination with boyhood and adolescence kind of continues right the way through Coil. But yeah, this display in Boy was up for just 2 days before police shut it down, and rumour has it that the charred remains are still kept in Scotland Yard's notorious Black Museum.
This is my new, by the way, bar for when people say an ad is subversive, because no, it's not, right? But like an ad is subversive if it is shut down by the police after 2 days of being up. That's subversive.
Yeah. So Sleazy also shot early publicity photos of the Sex Pistols, images that featured the band bloodied and bruised, Glenn Maddock topless in a public toilet, and Steve Jones handcuffed in pajamas. But unfortunately, these were ultimately vetoed by Malcolm McLaren, who deemed them too suggestively queer. Such scenes were likely rooted in Sleazy's earliest fantasies. He had known he was gay from a young age, and during his school years, he often wrote stories that involved castration and torture, usually directed at himself. As the art historian Simon Ford points out, Sleazy's nickname stemmed from his unabashed interest in using the body as an object of fetishistic exploration. In fact, Sleazy's interest, shall we say, in S&M was so notorious that it actually inspired the aesthetics of Clive Barker's 1987 film Hellraiser. Have you ever seen Hellraiser, Ben?
I have not seen Hellraiser, but tell me more.
Oh God, it's probably not worth a watch. Although, yeah, it's very campy, very 80s, kind of classic horror flick, in which there's this puzzle box that opens a gateway to a realm of sadomasochistic demons. And director Clive Barker was apparently very often visiting Sleazy's house for, shall we say, research purposes, going through Sleazy's vast collection of S&M pornography magazines. And Coil actually made a soundtrack
I'd
for
love
the
to
film.
do this kind of research.
Yeah, exactly.
Such research. Wow.
Very in-depth, very vigorous. So Coil actually made a soundtrack for this film as well, and you can listen to this, although it was rejected for being too weird by the Hollywood officials, and an orchestral score was chosen instead. In 1976, together with performance artists Cozy Fanny Tutti, Genesis P. Orridge, and sound engineer Chris Carter, Sleazy formed the band Throbbing Gristle. So Throbbing Gristle are credited with inventing the industrial genre, and they essentially bridged the gap between the avant-garde art world at the time and a youth culture that was growing increasingly disillusioned with rock music. Throbbing Gristle's sound can be described as explosive in every meaning of the word. Screamed vocals, pounding bass, and shrieking cornet. And alongside Chris Carter, Sleazy shaped the electronics, so synths, tape loops, amplifier, samplers, and drum machines. As the music journalist David Keenan puts it, Throbbing Gristle obliterated rock's usual single transmitter, 1,000 passive receivers principle, transforming the concert space into an interrogation room. Their aim wasn't just to make music, but to push sound into its most bodily, most extreme limits, assaulting both the audience and themselves with such high volumes it could induce tunnel vision or even make people sick. So Throbbing Gristle is named after Yorkshire slang for an erection, and they made their live debut at the notorious Prostitution exhibition at London's ICA Gallery. This ended up being extremely confrontational as a performance and triggered almost instant backlash. The exhibition was even debated in Parliament, with Tory MP Nicholas Fairbairn famously branding Throbbing Gristle the wreckers of civilization, a phrase that's since become a badge of honour. Did you know a little bit about this history, Ben?
I didn't. I mean, I knew who made up Throbbing Gristle, but this is exactly the kind of like music and subculture history that I'm the worst on. And it's always a joy for me to learn more about it. So thanks so much for taking us all through this.
Of course, yeah. I actually didn't know, connect the dots that Sleazy was part of Throbbing Gristle until a couple of years ago. And then I was like, yeah, oh my God, that makes complete sense.
I mean, again, I connected the dots because I'm friends with a Coil obsessive. And that's exactly the sort of thing that you hear about when you're friends with a Coil obsessive. But,
I don't really know if there's any other version of a Coil fan other than an obsessive. They're really, you love the band and then you just dive into every extreme part of them and become completely obsessed. I think it goes with the fan base.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to talk a bit about Throbbing Gristle because the logic underpinning them is very pertinent to Coil. It's kind of a response to a hostile world by exposing its underbelly. Throbbing Gristle narrated the horrors of the Vietnam War, the Moors murders, and the resurgence of fascistic and nationalistic sentiments in post-war Britain. Poignantly, despite declaring Throbbing Gristle degenerate and deviant, allegations of child molestation against MP Fairbairn emerged after his death, which raises the pointed question, who is the real wrecker of civilization? And this was very much the band's modus operandi, to expose the hypocrisy of a violent capitalistic world by mirroring back its violence and monotony. I mean, here I do want to acknowledge that Throbbing Gristle and later Coil did attract some Nazi and fascistic sympathizers amongst their fan base. And in part, this is because Throbbing Gristle did use Nazi imagery and Holocaust footage in their performances, which drew in a crowd of what Nick Soulsby calls cosplay fascists, edgelords, and outright Nazis. This is a bit of a loaded subject. I mean, some fans insist that Throbbing Gristle were simply provocative and their messaging was misunderstood. While I am sympathetic to this perspective, I do feel that as music journalists and historians, we have a duty to confront these undercurrents directly and not just fall into this trap of hero worship.
Yeah, from that same Coil obsessive friend from Elijah, I've heard so often some version of the following story. Part 1. Oh my God, I discovered this new black metal band. They seem so cool. Part 2. I found their Substack, part 3. Oh no.
Yeah, it's so
You know,
sad.
like
Yeah.
these bands turning out to be, or he actually sent me something today. It was a piece of writing by someone who's written a lot about occultism in ways that he's found really like interesting and helpful. And this person has now taken a hard turn into the sexual revolution was a mistake, the demographic crisis of the West, all the greatest hits of the right.
Jesus Christ. It's a terrible thing that is happening. And I think there has not really been enough done to, at least within the journalistic community, to kind of highlight these things, to call them out, to deplatform. While I was doing research, I came across this new book by the scholar Spencer Sunshine, and he has written a lot about kind of some industrial artists' connection to contemporary neo-Nazi movements and resurgence of neo-Nazi violence. So this is not just, a merely rhetorical thing where people are obviously saying horrendous stuff and it's just online. This does translate to the real world. And I do think, for me, this is not the bad gayness of Coil and Throbbing Gristle. I do not believe that Throbbing Gristle and Coil were fascists. They have openly denounced those views and separated themselves from these undercurrents. But, maybe they could have done a bit more. Maybe it could have been more of a push, these sort of things. And of course, it's kind of something that comes up whenever you mention Throbbing Gristle. I think, partly because of the moral panic, but around their music, but also because legitimately there are some terrible bad faith actors who are doing horrendous stuff, and let's not be misguided or ignore it. It's not going to go away.
Yeah, I think it's also important for American listeners to remember just how real a kind of organized fascist street presence was in the Britain of that time when Throbbing Gristle was playing. The organized, like, street gang level fascist far right was very, very much a part of daily life in a lot of communities in Britain at that time. And so it's not as though they were playing with an aesthetic that seemed really far off, right? Or that seemed impossible to imagine or to bring into the current world.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good point, actually. Like they weren't just, again, it's the same with Coil. It's not just provocative. I think that's flattening it. They were using Nazi aesthetics to pointedly say to this older generation, you fought the Nazis, but actually there is this resurgence of racism, of fascism in the National Front, within punk subculture, within Oi subculture, and we're going to use this iconography to throw it back in your face and be like, look at what you're doing. You're becoming Hitler. Yeah. But let's not linger too much on Throbbing Gristle because, of course, they could be their own podcast. But I did want to spend a little bit of time on them because Sleazy's part in the band was very formative to his sound, especially in shaping his use of William Burroughs' cut-up techniques. So Sleazy had met Burroughs in London and he had kept in regular contact with the American author of The Naked Lunch, occasionally even collaborating with him on music. Originally developed with the artist Brian Geisen, the cut-up method began with text, with physically slicing and rearranging words to disrupt meaning. But for both Burroughs and Sleazy, it ended up evolving into an audio technique as well. And they used cassette tape loops to kind of fracture time and to reveal hidden patterns. For Burroughs, who was also a gay man, the cut-up was not just an artistic tool, it was a weapon, a way to undermine the dominant systems of language, perception, and power. While in Throbbing Gristle, Sleazy built a very early version of a sampler, a device used to record and play back sound using Walkmans, cassette tapes, and a keyboard. And this knack for adapting and manipulating technology became integral to Coil's creative process. We certainly don't have space to go into it in this podcast, but it is worth, just mentioning how incredible Sleazy was with making machines and building custom studio space. And it was also well part of Throbbing Gristle that Sleazy met John Balance, a young fan of the band. In fact, Balance remembers seeing Sleazy's photograph on a Throbbing Gristle album cover and thinking, I'm going to spend the rest of my life with that man, which I think is quite cute, If only we could all manifest our crushes in such a way. John, who was 7 years younger than Sleazy, did not have an easy start, unfortunately. He was born on the 16th of February 1962 in Mansfield, Nottinghamshire, but spent much of his childhood on the move, attending 9 different schools before the age of 11. His parents separated when he was just 2, and he was shuffled between both sets of grandparents and his mother, who lived with her sister. At one point, he was made to sleep in a dog's basket, and in protest would bite the ankles of his mum's boyfriends. Eventually, his mother remarried, bringing a stepfather from the armed forces into the picture. According to Balance, this man was a bit of a horrible guy, sort of army man who punished anything he saw as effeminate. After short stints in Germany, Italy, and Scotland, Balance ended up in a state-funded boarding school where his fascination with the macabre flourished. He became especially interested in witchcraft and the occult, especially the writings of Aleister Crowley, as well as Dada and Surrealist art. He declared himself a pagan and refused to sing school hymns. A schoolmaster even wrote a letter home complaining that he was worshipping the moon and trying to astral project into other students' heads.
Oh, Aleister Crowley is always a very dangerous thing for people to discover a little bit of.
The great beast himself, yeah. In his teenage years, Balance had a breakdown and he was hospitalized for several months. It's been reported that he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, although journalist Nick Soulsby suggests this is unlikely, arguing it was probably dissociative identity disorder. I'm not going to comment on that too much, just because I don't really have the sources to back it up. And it is, schizophrenia was a bit of a loaded diagnosis back then, up until very recently. For example, even autism was considered a version of schizophrenia. So yeah, it makes sense that maybe it was confused with something else. But what is clear is that Balance, who was a very sensitive and creative person, was profoundly affected by these circumstances of his early life, the rejection and the bullying that he endured due to his queerness. And as an adult, schizophrenia, which was understood by Balance as kind of the inhabiting of multiple personalities, became central to his evolving artistic identity. This self-conceptualization was explored in his work as Coil's primary vocalist and as a poet. He was particularly known for his gift for glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, and he would often manipulate his voice using distortion, looping, and layered effects. This approach is especially vivid in tracks like Are You Shivering and Batwings, a liminal hymn from the 1999 album Music to Play in the Dark. And in the latter, language dissolves into this kind of improvised, invented tongue that evokes mystical states in speech. Altered states of consciousness were frequently sought out by Balance through lucid dreaming and the heavy use of drugs, particularly LSD and ecstasy. And these explorations deeply informed Coil's atmosphere and emotional intensity, although, as we'll get to, they did come at quite significant cost to his mental well-being as well. So one redemptive outlet during Balance's troubled childhood was music, and he became fiercely devoted to bands like Throbbing Gristle and Cabaret Voltaire, so much so that he launched his own fanzine, Stab Mental, where he interviewed some of his musical heroes. And it was through Stab Mental that he first connected with Sleazy, sparking a romantic and creative partnership that would endure for decades to come. So Coil's first live show took place at the Magenta Club in London on the 4th of August 1983. It was a duo performance with just Sleazy and John. By all accounts, it was a very strange, hypnotic set full of mangled violin with cassette tape loops of wolves, birds, and bells. And this event was organised around a screening of films by Kenneth Wynne Evans and Derek Jarman, the latter of whom would go on to become a lifelong creative ally. Coil's music appeared in several of Jarman's films, probably most famously 1993's Blue. Have you seen the film Blue, Ben?
Of course, it's an extraordinary, extraordinary film. So yeah, Jarman was dying of AIDS-related illness, and one of the effects of that illness was that he could only see blue. he lost his sight. And so it's a film which is just a blue screen, and then everything takes place in music and voiceover. It's a really remarkable thing.
Yeah, very beautiful and very moving. And Coil's music kind of becomes this emotional landscape in the absence of the visual imagery. Indeed, we can place Coil within a kind of wider constellation of boundary-pushing gay creatives in 1980s London. Filmmakers like Jarman and John Maybury, choreographer Michael Clarke, and the Australian performance artist Lee Bowery. And of course, they shared a lot more than just artistic sensibilities with this cohort. Sleazy and Balance had an open relationship, and they were very active in the underground club scene. They were renowned for hosting sex parties and regularly engaging the services of rent boys. In fact, Coil also soundtracked the film adaptation of Dennis Cooper's novel Frisk, and they made a kind of Balearic house composition for the first safe sex video guide made for Britain's gay community. So released in 1992, this is an X-rated yet ostensibly educational AIDS documentary, and it was distributed on VHS, although it was recently showing on Mubi, so check it out online if you haven't seen it.
That is absolutely incredible. And also, if you're interested in these kinds of aesthetics, I'd really recommend the episode that we did about Dennis Cooper, author of Frisk, with Dermot Hester. It's a great episode and based on his biography of Cooper. So highly encourage folks to head on over and listen to that when you're done with this conversation.
In 1984, Coil released their first full-length album, Scatology. Metaphorically dense, the record draws on Sleazy's personal fetish, as well as alchemal visions of turning filth into gold. Some of the sounds, such as shitting, toilets, were raw noises, Balance explained. We were making good things from what's perceived as bad things, dealing with subjects other people wouldn't touch, like rotting and death. So sonically, Scatology is built around these kind of found samples, pop rock, fuzzed out guitar riffs, alongside the grinding machinery of industrial noise. And the band drew inspiration from Crowley's poem Lear Sublime, which celebrates scatophilia, and they were actually immersed in Crowley's concept of sex magic. So Ben, what is sex magic, I hear you ask? So sex magic is the belief associated with Crowley that sexual energy, especially the mixing of bodily fluids, holds immense occult power. So interestingly, Crowley initially believed that sex magic was only possible through heterosexual unions, but after lots of further exploration, concluded that male-male lovers could be equally, if not more potent. In his view, semen and excrement were not waste, but ritual substances, capable of summoning demons or uncovering the secrets of the universe. So I think, in the shadow of the AIDS crisis, this invocation of sex magic kind of reads as a radical reclamation of not only queer desire, but queer promiscuity. And scatology operates as a kind of confrontation. It's a parody against the era's homophobia, in which gay men were portrayed as polluting normal society with their so-called unnatural acts. At a time when the rhetoric of contagion and sin was everywhere, imagery of excrement was never far behind. For example, in 1986, James Anderton, Chief Constable of Greater Manchester, told a conference on AIDS that gay men were, quote, swirling around in a human cesspit of their own making, which is just, deplorable. So Scatology also gave us one of Coil's most iconic and harrowing works, their cover of Tainted Love. So if you've not seen this already, I really would encourage you to go and seek it out on YouTube. It's also now part of the Museum of Modern Art's permanent collection. It's Tainted Love is originally a kind of upbeat Northern soul track from the 1960s, and their version is this kind of mournful funeral dirge pierced by these guttural klaxons, transforming the titular phrase into a stark commentary on illness and intimacy. The single actually made history as the first to donate proceeds to the AIDS charity, the Terence Higgins Trust. This landmark is all the more striking given the song's tonal juxtaposition, its kind of heavy, gothic, experimental leanings, which are starkly contrasted with the kind of aesthetics of something like Diane Warwick and Elton John and Gladys Knight and Stevie Wonder singing That's What Friends Are For as part of an AIDS benefit. In fact, Sleazy had this great phrase about Coil's sensibilities, which was, "We're friends of Dorothy, not of Elton." Both Sleazy and Balance managed to avoid infection, but neither was spared the trauma of watching many friends, lovers, and creative collaborators succumb. When their friend Eddie Carnes, the artist who had designed the cover art for their cover of Tainted Love, died at home from AIDS-related complications, Balance described how members of the Hammersmith Council arrived in hazmat suits and wrapped the body in sheets of plastic, and their long association with Jarman, of course, unfolded in the shadow of his HIV diagnosis and eventual death. This litany of loss is just everywhere in Coil's discography, from Scatology to its follow-up Horse Rovinator, which is an album just full of death and kind of apocalyptic visions, right through to the final recordings with the Ape of Naples. And there's this track called It's in My Blood, on which Balance is kind of screaming in full force, "It's in my blood" scream, "It's in my blood" scream, and it's horrifying and kind of unforgettable. So in 1991, Coil released Love's Secret Domain, which was one of their most commercially successful records. It's very club-focused, danceable, fusing acid house with mystical trance, bringing together a bon tempo keyboard, classically trained string players, and flamenco guitars. And you might notice that Love's Secret Domain forms an acronym LSD, and of course it certainly lives up to its title. Apparently, the band recorded the album under the influence of heavy doses of psychedelia and stimulants, spending 3 days in the studio without sleep. Bandmate Stephen Thrower described the experience as torturous, marked by shared hallucinations, constant arguments, and a mastering phase he likened to doing surgery on the innards of a squid.
And now all of you know what it's like for us to make a season of Bad Gays. No, I kid. I just want to make it clear that I'm joking, but I had to make the joke anyway.
So Coil had been experimenting with MDMA and ecstasy since the very early 1980s, and they would import it over from the Netherlands, like long before the drugs became accessible in the UK. But by the decade's end, things were starting to take a bit of a darker turn. They were taking so much, basically, that they would have these horrendous come downs. And in order to deal with that, Balance would drink a lot of alcohol. And that's sort of where, the chemical fallout of it was just causing a terrible impact on his mental health. In fact, Sleazy said that the drugs became a kind of replacement for intimacy that didn't involve sexual contact as a kind of consequence of AIDS. And it was this relationship, of course, with alcohol that would eventually prove fatal for John Balance.
Yeah, I mean, for so many people who were around the horrors of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, even people who survived the disease itself, substances became a very, I think, understandable way often of finding escape from, or processing, or finding some kind of a seeming respite from what they had just gone through. And it makes sense that a lot of people who were traumatized by this ended up then also having abuse issues that maybe were related to that.
Oh, absolutely. And, you can really see, I mean, sex was not only something that they enjoyed to do, but it was an intrinsic part of their creative methodology, outlook. They viewed it through the lens of mysticism and occultism. And you can just imagine, like, maybe losing this ability to have these erotic encounters in this empowering way, like how completely fucked up that would be. And, these were young men in their 30s. Sleazy was early 30s. Balance was mid-20s. It was just devastating. And not only that, but you're losing your whole creative community. Balance would describe watching Jarman slowly die from AIDS, and he would continue to direct until the final months of his life, just from a mattress on the floor, like blind and covered in sores. It's just horrible and so sad and deeply traumatizing. But the band had other reasons to seek escape. In 1992, the UK saw the arrival of the Satanic Panic, echoing the hysteria that had swept America. On the 16th of February that year, the Observer newspaper published an article about a newly unearthed videotape that was supposedly containing evidence of ritual abuse. So this tape was actually an art film called First Transmission, and it had been made a decade earlier by Sleazy, Balance, Genesis Peorage of Throbbing Gristle, Derek Jarman and others who were sort of members of the band Psychic TV and the associated magical collective, the Temple of Psychic Youth.
This would be the same Observer newspaper that these days is constantly claiming to have seen Goody Proctor dancing with the devil at the gender clinic.
Yeah, that trash rag. An experimental artwork, First Transmission, features scenes of consensual subjugation, and these include like a bound and hooded John Balance being urinated on, intercut with Jarman's sonorous voiceover. And snippets ended up being screened in this sort of Dispatches documentary on Channel 4, and they claimed that the footage showed child abuse and even murder. I mean, thankfully, these allegations very quickly unraveled, and it was shown to be nonsense, very overblown, and the production company behind the documentary was exposed as a front for a born-again Christian fundamentalist group. So yeah, essentially all nonsense, but it did not prevent a very then sick and dying Jarman from being hounded at his home by the press, which is disgusting. We can see this whole ordeal as part of a much broader wave of police repression that was targeting queer men. For example, in 1987, there was an investigation known as Operation Spanner. If you haven't heard of it, this is an extremely, horrific legal episode in recent UK history, and its repercussions are still echoing out today. Operation Spanner involved the detainment and questioning of over 100 gay and bisexual men, and many of whom had never met, but they had exchanged letters containing violent fantasies or even just procured genital piercings. So a bunch of them ended up prosecuted and under this kind of conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm, and the presiding judge ruled that no one could legally consent to being injured, which effectively made all forms of S&M illegal in the UK. The legal definition of assault was even expanded to include love bites, scratch marks, and consensual spanking. At one point, police raided offices of a spanking magazine in London, and these laws are still on the books to this day.
Well, that makes sense for the very normal island that is England.
This green and unpleasant land. Yeah, I mean...
Makes me a bit green.
Yeah. I think this history is kind of worth excavating a little bit. I was listening to this podcast earlier this year, a bit about the allegations against the author Neil Gaiman, and I won't comment on that case because it's still unfolding. I mean, I will say that it obviously does raise some very serious questions about abuse of power, but there was this line from the podcast that struck with me where the host said that these laws restricting BDSM, they exist solely to protect victims. And I do think that that's a very one-dimensional reading because it overlooks like the historical reality of how these laws have been used, and in particular how they have targeted queer men. So if we want to talk seriously about harm and protection, I think we do need to, reckon honestly with this legacy.
Oh, certainly. We also need to reckon with the fact that laws which make consensual spanking illegal are unlikely to be evenly applied, right? Like laws which make love bites illegal are unlikely to be evenly applied, right? If we want to talk about using the law to shape or change behavior, or using the law to be able to, for victims of assault and abuse to some sort of justice, then they need laws that are actually about the things that are happening to them and about the problem with what is happening to them, and not laws that make a consensual spanking magazine illegal.
Yeah, I think this is the problem, with carceral solutions to these kind of issues of consent, I feel, is that they are applied in very discriminatory ways and they are weaponized. And, of course, homosexuality was legalized in 1967, but there was an extreme wave of repression which Operation Scanner, which these kind of crackdowns on gay pornography we're all part of, and we need to talk about those things because they're there. And yeah.
Well, yeah, and we're also in a moment when, there's kind of increasing prominence, a sort of return of certain forms of radical feminism that are talking about, then pornography again and stuff. And it should be remembered that, one of the big legal cases in Canada when porn was banned there was against a lesbian feminist porn magazine, which shouldn't be surprising to anyone who's thought about this. And yet.
Yeah, and yet.
Enemy Feminisms by friend of the show, Sophie Lewis. Important read.
Yeah, Sophie's work is fantastic on this subject in particular. Both Balance and Sleazy were caught up in this atmosphere of fear, and they both had friends and collaborators that were targeted in Operation Spanner. John was stopped and searched by police, and he ended up suffering a nervous breakdown as a result. The pair recalled being so terrified that they destroyed anything that could implicate them, including artwork and archival material, spending several years half expecting the front door to be kicked in. This is obviously, really grim stuff, but on a lighter note, I've always quite enjoyed Genesis P. Orridge's personal theory on this matter, which is that the ruling classes cracked down on the democratization of S&M because they knew it held ritual magic potential, and they didn't want that power in the hands of the proletariat. Like, I'm not usually one for conspiracy theories, but I will say that one's probably too, and I think Michel Foucault would agree.
Yeah, it does. It does. It's one of these things that seems so offbeat, but it makes its own kind of sense when you think about it that way. I mean, if you want to be less magical about it, there's also, like this sort of long history of writing about class contact in queer sex, right? And queer sex being this often quite generative or destabilizing moment around class boundaries, and sometimes restabilizing as well, right? Like, it's not like the act of sodomy is automatically revolutionary, but it's often been sort of associated with that. And so maybe you could think about some of that stuff for SM as well.
Oh yeah, with all the caveats. So after all of this turmoil, and amid Balance's worsening struggles with alcohol, the pair ended up relocating to Weston-super-Mare on the coast of England, and they moved into this very grand house overlooking the Bristol Channel. But there, increasingly isolated, Balance's dependency on alcohol only deepened. In November 2004, he fell over the banisters on the first floor, plunging some 15 feet. Although he was rushed to hospital, his condition deteriorated, and he died soon after without ever regaining consciousness. Coil effectively disbanded following Balance's death, with Sleazy moving to Thailand, where he died in his sleep from a heart attack in 2010. And yeah, that's the story of Coil.
Well, thank you so much for that biography and for bringing us a little bit more into Coil's life and their work and their worlds. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the relationship between the band and the HIV/AIDS pandemic. I think there might be a sort of easy viewing, an easy reading, an ignorant reading that might see their aesthetics, sort of aesthetics of monstrosity around gay sex, right, as having something to do with the pandemic. But it seems like actually that aesthetic well predated it. It almost seemed to sort of fit the moment, right, as this terrible history unfolded.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And it's interesting the way that people, I think especially straight male journalists, kind of read into it. It was always through this, oh wow, this is so weird and so gross and so monstrous, And Coil would sort of sit there and be like, no, but we really enjoy scat and we really enjoy sex. And what do you mean? It's, monstrous. It's just us. And, there's a whole other conversation, I think, about authenticity and artists or pop stars or musicians or whatever. But I do feel in a way there was this kind of misreading of what they were trying to convey. And absolutely, this goes all the way back to Sleazy's very earliest fantasies as a young schoolboy. He was completely perverse in this very unapologetic, very admirable way from a very young age. I can't imagine that must have been easy for him. Yeah, it's something that I find very, very admirable about them, that they just kind of stuck with it and refused to conform, refused to be any less weird, any less strange, any less perverted. It's great.
You spoke a lot about this kind of panic around the aesthetics of BDSM, right? And a kind of relationship between the aesthetics of BDSM to abuse. And it does seem like Coil were part of a group of people who were really living what they sang about and really kind of living pretty hard and sleeping around. And I mean, did that ever come with anything? I mean, we spoke earlier about I don't want to compare Coil and Rammstein artistically, but we spoke earlier about the kind of Rammstein allegations, right? Have there been any allegations like that around Coil?
Not that I can find. I mean, it is worth sort of talking a little bit about their relationship with Thailand, and in particular, I think Sleazy's sort of perception of boyhood and adolescence, which was a state, very much like Dennis Cooper, that they were both interested in. They have a fantastic song called Teenage Lightning, which is really great, sort of exploring this state of adolescence and desire and being in the world as a young person, and that kind of like charged energy you have as a teenager, sexual and otherwise. So I think if you Google Coil or look up them on YouTube, probably one of the first results will be the title track for Love's Secret Domain, which I believe was banned at a certain point because it was filmed in this kind of Thai go-go bar, and it features John Balance singing kind of karaoke style, surrounded by these extremely young-looking male dancers. As I understand it, all of the dancers were over 18, but I think what it speaks more to maybe is just the way that Coil perceived Thailand, and this is a country that they went back to many times, with Sleazy obviously eventually moving there permanently, and he once said that Thailand is somewhere we feel very comfortable in because the place itself is so trippy, and one is so close to other levels of existence, other types of perception that are just so alien. So obviously you could hear some kind of exoticization here, but yeah, it speaks for itself, I guess.
Yeah, of course, and the association of that with adolescence, it is really common in all kinds of Western thought. Yeah.
And of course, there I do want to be careful. I think it was a wonderful exploration in the Dennis Cooper episode where adolescence, I think there is an interest in exploring adolescence artistically and maybe inhabiting it as an artist and then being abusive essentially. And there isn't any evidence that I could find in my research that showed that they had, bad practices in that regard.
Right, and it's important to say that because it's important to talk about kind of bad discourse, or the way that bad discourse infects even dissident art, right? And it's important to talk about the possibilities for abuse, but what we don't want to do is to make a world in which evidence of perversion is considered to be evidence of abuse, right? That's what these bad UK laws would want us to do, and unfortunately, that's what a lot of tender queers would also want us to do. And so it's important to keep these things on a kind of separate, and partially because it is so vitally important that when abuse happens, we're actually talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it's sort of been a difficult line to toe as well around this subject because, of course, Frub and Gristle were subject to such moral panic and Coil had this homophobic backlash. I mean, something I maybe would have liked to have gone a bit more into is sort of the relationship between Balance's mental health and his sort of performance of it, which was quite troubling at times. He performed on stage in a straitjacket, and there was even a vinyl release called the Trauma Edition in which he had self-harmed and dripped blood onto some of the album covers, and they were sold as kind of special editions. This sort of thing I find really tricky and difficult to approach. But yeah, this, performance of a self, an exaggerated version, I do see it somehow connected with their queerness and as a way to cope somehow, but also very troubling.
Thanks so much for telling us that story, Hannah. Now we have our concluding conversation, which, as always, Coil, bad, gay, not bad, not gay? Where do we put him?
I think in a
real
kind
gay,
of like
real
yeah,
gay.
real
I think we can all
gay.
agree.
Yeah, but also in this way, I think that maybe Dennis Cooper is a bad gay in the sense that he is a bad, a perverted, dissident, deviant gay, and, wanting to take desires to the extreme. And, what is unfortunate is that they were so punished and literally policed for that. And I think in another sense, they're a bad gay in the way that, as I mentioned at the start of the podcast, they really kind of failed to maybe reach gay audiences within their time. I think now with re-releases, with a lot more material online, they're starting to reach people more, reach more queer audiences, and kind of being reclaimed. But at the time, it was very difficult. And yeah, I mean, Balance had this, we're not fairies on top of the cake, which is a bit like we're not like the other gays. But in a sense, what he was saying is that if you didn't kind of perform in this very kind of glamorized or shiny commercial disco fashion, then you weren't accepted. And I guess, thankfully, things have changed a bit since then.
Thanks so much for that conversation, Hannah. I know I'm really excited to now go and listen to a bunch of Coil and watch some videos and some of the things that they scored. But if our listeners wanted to go a couple places, and we've linked to these in the show notes, by the way, where should they go to hear some Coil or to see some Coil or to see them in action?
I would definitely check out the Gay Man's Guide to Safer Sex. That's a bit unexpected Coil. Yeah, as I said, it's kind of Balearic house. Love Secret Domain, obviously fantastic. Time Machines and Music to Play in the Dark. And there is a new record, a re-release of Black Antlers coming out very soon, probably around the time that this podcast is landing.
Fantastic. That all sounds really great. And if people wanted to learn more about Coil, maybe some of the sources that you used to tell this story, where can we turn? Where can they turn?
So a Bible of this podcast was England's Hidden Reverse by David Keenan, and that is also about the music of Current 93 and Nurse with Wound, two bands that Coil also were part of and kind of circulated with. And then I would really recommend Everything Keeps Dissolving by Nick Soulsby, which is that collection of interviews and conversations. And in fact, Nick Soulsby is a really wonderful writer. In fact, I think one of the best writers about Coil. And if you can find him in zines and online articles, go there. Lastly, I will say as well that Cozy Fanny Tootie's autobiography, she was part of Throbbing Gristle, which is called Art, Sex and Music, is really great and an important document of women's role and particularly her role in the band at a time, when women were not treated very nicely within the art world and especially during the music world as well. And since I've mentioned Genesis P. Orridge a few times in this episode, I do also want to acknowledge that in the book Art, Sex, Music, Cozy Fanny Tootie describes experiences of physical, psychological, and sexual abuse by Genesis, both during their relationship and during the time when they worked together in Throbbing Gristle. We can also link to some more reporting on that in the show notes. And Cozy is still making music, so I would encourage listeners to go and check out her records as well. They're fantastic.
Thanks so much, Hannah. If people want to follow your work or to see more things that you do, where should they turn?
You can find me mostly on Instagram. I am working on a website at the moment, or come and find me next year in February and March. I'll be curating at Sonic Axe Biannual, which is a festival dedicated to sound art, music, and technology, doing lots of things with sound that are very weird and techie, and maybe Coil would have approved of them as well.
Great. And the Instagram, of course, is linked in the show notes. Well, you can find me online at benwritesthings.blueskies.social or Ben Writes Things on Instagram. You can find the show at Bad Gays Pod on Blue Sky and also on Instagram, and of course at badgayspod.com. And as always, you can support the show by visiting patreon.com/badgayspod to subscribe to our subscriber-only show, Extra Bad Gays. Thanks so much, and we'll see you soon for more specials and or season 9. Cheers.
Bad gays.